Good morning to all our attendees. We welcome you to this session of the Slave Dwelling Project Conference. We welcome Pauline Merrick, who is presenting Beyond the Plantation, Slavery in Connecticut. She will be presenting, and we ask that you hold your questions until the end, but you can enter those in the chat and we will address those. I'm going to pass it over to Pauline. Take it away.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to the Slave Dwelling Project for inviting me to talk today. And I need you to share my screen, please. There I am. I was born in Connecticut, raised in Connecticut, educated in Connecticut, and never knew anything about the fact that slavery existed in Connecticut. I went to a very good high school. Slavery was something that happened somewhere else. We did, talk about it in school, but it didn't pertain to our lives in particular. Hold on, there we go. So it doesn't surprise me now when I run into people here in Connecticut who also don't know this. What do you mean there were slaves in Connecticut? They didn't grow cotton here. And I can understand their confusion, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed and addressed strongly. And another thing that I do tell them is even if there hadn't been any enslaved people in Connecticut, which there certainly were, Connecticut is dotted with these old mills, and those were textile mills, textile being cotton. These industries were dependent on cotton from the South, which was produced by the enslaved people in the South, of course. And this demand for cotton certainly extended that institution much longer than it needed to be. These two pictures here are Panoma Mills, which is close to me, a historic picture and a picture of what it looks like today. These mills make beautiful condo projects, and everybody thinks they're lovely. I am not a historian. I'm a genealogist, and I've been a genealogist most of my life. And during my experience as a professional genealogist, I was asked on a few occasions to research African American families here in Connecticut. And years ago, I was very naive about this and thought that this would be simple. I'm used to doing research, not understanding that the records were going to be different or why they were going to be different. And I have educated myself on that during my research. I've read and studied on the history of Connecticut, and I learned a lot. And I learned a lot about the intersection of genealogy and history. And as a genealogist, I really enjoy digging out the personal stories that make up the history of the state. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We do have some documentation existing for enslaved men, women, and children who were brought here from Africa or from the West Indies during the colonial period in Connecticut. We can search those documents out, and I really encourage everybody, if you find these stories, to publish them. We're going to talk about how slavery began in the Connecticut colony, why the system was established, and how a colony that's generally seen as being based on upright, moral, religious people justified this system. We're going to see how that system expanded through the state and how these enslaved persons were controlled through legislation. And then we're going to move on to finding what records are available, remembering all the time that the Black servants were in no way thought to be the same as white Europeans. To start this process, you have to unlearn what you learned in grammar school if you were educated in the same way that I was. We were taught that the Pilgrims came to the shores at Plymouth and, in cooperation with friendly Indians, built thriving communities where morally upright white men lived self-sufficiently. And for the goods they could not produce, they harvested trees for shipmass and trapped beavers for their pelts to trade. This image isn't necessarily untrue, but it's far from the complete truth. The complete truth is that from the beginning of the New England colonies, there was a severe shortage of labor. It was simply too much for the few available men to do all these chores, plus provide goods to trade. So, where were they going to get a labor force? And to answer that question, we need to understand that this was an English colony. This was part of the British Empire and was established by England. So, why was England eager to establish a colony here in New England? And the answer is simply profit and power. England was expanding its claim on regions all over the map, but most importantly to our subject are the islands in what became known as the West Indies. A settlement was established in Bermuda in 1610, and Bermuda is just off this map up to the northeast. It was established as a resupply point on the voyage from England to the Virginia colony. They tried growing tobacco there, like they did in Virginia, but it wasn't very successful. In 1627, the Barbados Company was chartered to colonize the island of Barbados. And in Barbados, they soon discovered that sugar cane grew very well. Barbados and the surrounding islands became the world's leader in sugar production over the next 4 decades. Meanwhile, a small boatload of religious dissenters landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, what is now Massachusetts. Those first permanent settlers in New England were escaping religious persecution in England. Now, they did not fund their own voyage here. They were backed. They had financial backers. They were expected to use the resources that were here in this largely unexplored land to enrich England, pay back their backers. They were expected to trade timber and fish to begin with, and later farm products and manufactured goods. As we said, England was in it for the buck. So on one hand, we have New England is this big untapped resource, unlimited land available, ports available for shipping, timber, which was in short supply throughout most of the British Empire, especially the West Indies after they cut it all down to grow sugar. That was plentiful in New England. Fish were abundant in the coastal waters. But as I said, New England had a severe shortage of labor. On the other hand, the West Indies were ideal for sugarcane production, and the world was going mad for sugar. This valuable commodity was planted in every available acre. They didn't leave enough room to grow their own food. They imported food to the West Indies from New England, along with building timber. And in return, the New Englanders brought back the sugar, molasses, and enslaved people to fill the labor shortage. After 1700, the transatlantic slave trade became more frequent, with the ports of Boston, Newport, Bristol, and New London being the base of much of the trade. But in these early days, it was pretty much direct trade between New England and the West Indies. So to the West Indies from New England went potatoes, corn, onions, salt pork, dried cod, etc., 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 and enslaved Indians. They tried that first. They tried making the Indians work for them, but it was too easy for them to slip away into the woods and rejoin their own people. And in return, back to Connecticut came sugar and molasses and enslaved Negroes from the West Indies. In those early days, enslaved people that came from the West Indies were actually preferred for a couple of reasons. And those reasons were, first of all, a lot of them had been born into slavery. They knew what was expected of them. They weren't, wild Africans being brought into staid little New England. For the most part, they could speak English, at least somewhat, and they had been exposed to smallpox in many cases. Smallpox killed thousands and thousands of people all over the world. So having someone who had already been exposed to smallpox was a plus because they weren't going to come here, get exposed, and die soon after. So this is a map of Connecticut in 1670. And as you can see, almost all of these towns were seaport towns. This big river in the center is the Connecticut River. The first towns created were Windsor and Wethersfield. Almost everything else is along the coast, except for up here we have Norwich, and we're going to be talking about Norwich and New London quite a bit. Norwich was a very important port because you could go up this Thames River, and it is the Thames, not the Thames, from New London, and have this nice harbor that was very well protected here in New London. Excuse me, Norwich. New London's down here on the coast. So we've got a couple of dozen towns navigable by ocean-going ships. These towns were founded on trade. The people didn't go there to become farmers. They came there to trade. A couple of the towns were expanding further into the interior. Up there by Hartford and Windsor, you can see a couple of farming communities had started by 1670, and that Connecticut River Valley was beautiful farmland. The products from those towns, though, however, were taken to the port towns for trade. And they were taken to the port towns, and ships went down to the West Indies, traded those foodstuffs for, as we talked about, sugar and slaves. So again, New England is just one of many British colonies. All these colonies were expected to enrich Britain, and cooperation just produced more wealth. So how did these religious New Englanders justify slavery? It's right in the Bible. Piece of cake. Thy bondmen and the bondsmaids which shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Well, what's more heathen than Native Americans? What's more heathen than people with black skins? Obviously, they would make good slaves, according to their Bible. And New England quickly adopted the Barbados custom that the children of enslaved mothers were enslaved for life, rather than the ancient British custom of the children following the state of the father. Now, slavery in New England was a bit different than it was in the South. And on the left-hand side here of this slide, you can see what we think of as a typical photo of enslaved people in the South picking cotton, large groups of them. In the North, it was much more likely that a household would own just one or two slaves rather than, 50, 60, 100, whatever it took to run a big plantation. The women would quite often help the white woman of the house with her household chores, including cooking and cleaning, tending the kitchen garden, sewing, weaving, spinning. So they were in fairly close contact with the families, while the enslaved men were more likely to be outside working in the fields or working with livestock. Some of the men, especially who were enslaved by artisans, say blacksmiths or coopers or cabinet makers, would take up that trade and become skilled themselves. A lot more men than women were actually brought to the colony of Connecticut because they needed them more for the farming and the livestock tending than they needed the women for the inside work. And another thing is the northern slaves were much more likely to be housed in the home of the enslaver, usually in an attic or small, otherwise useless room. And we can find evidence of this in the records. An inventory in 1758 from the estate of David Judson of Stratford, Connecticut, included 2 beds and bedsteads in the lower kitchen for the Negroes. And another thing is, enslaved persons in New England were very often taught to read. They were taught to read so that they could read the Bible. They were, in many cases, targeted for Christianization. These two charts, these both say the same thing. They're just laid out a little bit differently. And it shows the growth of slavery in Connecticut from 1690 through the start of the Revolution. and it increased sharply after 1700. Connecticut, from the very beginning, was a wealthy state. Wealthy people came here in order to tap into the great profits that were to be made from this sugar trade, the West Indies trade in particular. Cheap labor still in short supply. Even households with moderate means had the ability to procure one or two enslaved persons to help, especially with chopping wood and tending fields. It's said that by the time of the Revolution, half of the ministers, lawyers, and public officials in Connecticut owned at least one slave, and a third of all Connecticut doctors had at least one enslaved servant. And with the doctors, it's particularly interesting because these servants would assist the doctors and often became very skilled in medicine themselves. There weren't really any medical colleges around. Doctors pretty much learned things on the job, and so did their enslaved men. During that time, New London County, I pointed out New London on that map earlier, became the largest slaveholding area in all of New England, partly because of the port and partly because of industrial growth there. It became a center of business and overseas trades, and they had good proximity to the large farms in southeastern Connecticut and the state of Rhode Island. And these were often referred to as plantations, and they were growing food for the West Indies. So slavery became the driving force of the economy here in Connecticut as it did elsewhere. They were needed for labor to produce crops and farm animals, cotton, processed timber, catch and dry fish. And again, those goods were brought to places such as Barbados and traded. So the labor of subjugated people was the basis for the growing wealth of New England and of the British Empire. Let's talk for a minute about laws regarding slavery in Connecticut. And I'm sometimes asked, well, when did slavery become legal in Connecticut? And my answer to that is, when did catching a fish become legal? It was always legal. It was brought here from Britain. And it was a fact from the earliest days here in Connecticut, the Connecticut and New Haven colonies. As I said, those first towns in New England, Windsor and Wethersfield, were established by 1634. And the court records in Connecticut indicate that in the year 1646, so just 12 years later, they decided that slavery was a legitimate punishment for Indians and Africans. So just 10 years after the founding of the colonies, they were familiar with having Africans in their midst. In 1690, laws were passed restricting the ability of Blacks and Indians to travel out of their town of residence and what hours they could be on the roads. In 1702, it became necessary to pass legislation which required former enslavers to support their former property if they were free and indigent. Now, you don't pass laws because you're afraid something's going to happen in the future. You pass laws because something is happening now. So what was happening is these enslaved persons would become ill, infirm, or aged, and they were simply turned out to fend for themselves. So laws were needed and were passed to stop that practice and make the enslavers responsible for their upkeep. By 1708, they passed a law setting the punishment of any Negro who dared to strike or assault a white person as 30 lashes. In 1730, that law was expanded to include libel or slander of a white person by a Black. This is a little example here of laws that were developed. In 1711, this man by the name of Robert Jacklin was freed by Dr. Peter Tappan, and he moved to New London, Connecticut. In 1716, he had the temerity to buy a house. New London, of course, went nuts, and they immediately called a town meeting, and in April of 1717, they passed a local ordinance forbidding Black people from owning property. And they petitioned the state legislature to do the same thing, which they said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. So it became illegal in 1717 for any Black person to own property. That was spottily enforced. You can find plenty of deeds if you look around that where Black people did, in fact, own property. Slavery continued to be legal in Connecticut until 1848. The Gradual Emancipation Act of 1784 began that process, where enslaved persons born after that date must be set free after a set number of years of service. Now, that sounds very nice. This is just after the Revolutionary War. And after the Revolutionary War, slavery began a decline throughout New England. And part of that reason, I think, was the fact that Americans, the new Americans, had fought for their freedom from Britain, and perhaps some of them thought that freedom was a good thing and should be extended to the Black residents. But I think a bigger reason was economic. The Revolutionary War was a very expensive war. Rich people used their own money to fund it. There was no treasury, there was no budget. And it costs a lot of money. Rich people chipped in and lost a lot of their wealth. Uh, Middle class people went broke. People couldn't pay their taxes after the war. White men were looking for work. So, in order to free up jobs for white men to come into the labor force, who are we going to kick out? I think we should consider banning slavery. So let's talk a couple minutes about records. We've covered the history of slavery in Connecticut. We'll take a look at records that we can actually find that will back up our stories that we can use to discover news stories. This is one of my favorites. New London, as I said, was one of the largest slaveholding regions. It was the largest slaveholding region in New England. And the New London Historical Society produced this book several years ago, and they've gone through all the records in New London County to try to assemble the records of African Americans who lived here. And this is an example. This is that same Robert Jacklin example I showed you earlier. But reading this not only tells you about Robert Jacklin, but it tells you the kind of sources that they used to reassemble these families and to tell the stories of these individuals. We've got vital records, we've got diaries, we have land records, town meeting minutes, court records. So just looking through these just give you some great ideas of where to search for these records. The DAR is actually playing a small part here. They are trying to collect information on any non-white person who might have served in some capacity in the Revolutionary War. And this database is online. It is free to look at, and it's broken down by state. So you can look to see what information they have about African Americans from Connecticut who may have served in the Revolutionary War. And they are also building this database. So if you find things that they don't have already, they want to hear from you. And one of the things that they point out here is that in Connecticut, a lot of enslaved men were manumitted in order to fight in the Revolutionary War. This was not early in the war, because early in the war, they did not accept African Americans to enlist. But later they did, and but they had to be manumitted on most occasions. Some of those manumissions had some strings attached, some didn't. But that's an interesting thing to look for. The public records of the colony of Connecticut. This is all the records of colonial Connecticut legislature and courts. And these are online, they're free. You can find them on Internet Archive or Family Search. There are several volumes, and it covers the years from 1636 through 1776. These are online, they're searchable. You can put in search terms to find out what sort of laws they were passing about Negroes, what sort of court cases came up about enslaved persons. So I can search by the term Negro. This is volume 3, and this is that actual 1702 law that said that you simply couldn't turn people out when they were no longer of working value to you. So this is an interesting place to look for laws that pertained to slavery in Connecticut. In Connecticut, we have this thing called the Barber Collection, which is just a collection of birth, death, marriage records in the state, and it's broken down by town. Not every town is covered, but most of them are. So you can see here, I was looking in the town of Pomfret, Connecticut, and Ebenezer Williams had an enslaved woman by the name of Beck. And Beck had a child that they named Jude, born on November 26, 1760. So here we've got colonial records of enslaved people, and this is something you may not find in other places in the country. Unfortunately, both Jude and Beck died the following year. At the end of a lot of these volumes, and these are on Ancestry, they're on Family Search, they're on various people on places online where you can find them. At the ends of the books, you have listings of people where the surname is not listed. And these first few entries in this example are all white women whose marriages were recorded, but they neglected to record their married names. So you have to be a little bit careful. But down the bottom here, you see obviously Phyllis Negro died August 15th, 1774. You'd have to do a little digging to find out who Phyllis was. But there are some records in these town records. New London, as I said, largest population of African Americans in Connecticut before the Revolution. They actually put a section in the end that describes Negroes and Indians. You can see there's various people listed here. Some are Black, some are Indians. In East Haddam, Connecticut, no surname. Again, we have several white women who married, but they didn't record their maiden name. But down at the end here, we have Punch. And we're given a second name for Punch, alias John Camel, married X Mason, a Negro, both of East Haddam in October of 1803, and it notes that they are free people of color. Letters can be very interesting. This is a letter from Jedediah Huntington to his father, Jabez Huntington. The Huntington family was very wealthy and very powerful. Their base of operations was in Norwich, Connecticut, that inland port town that I showed you earlier. Jabez Huntington, hugely wealthy. At least 4 of his sons became generals in the Revolutionary War, including Jedediah. But this is before that, 1765. Jedediah is writing to his father. Joseph Williams, 2 Negroes fall into your hands. And down below, the Negro boy is at our house and the girl is with Williams. So this is evidence that he is purchasing 2 young African American servants who it looks like he's going to turn around and sell. In this case, this is a project I'm working on right now, and it's very interesting. I'm hoping to get this published before the end of the year. I think that Negro boy stayed with Jedediah. Jedediah became first a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and this is a listing of the enlisted men in his regiment in 1775. They were camped in Roxbury, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, during the siege of Boston by the British. And down here at the bottom, one of his enlisted people is Samuel, Negro. And he is enlisted. This person is mentioned in other letters between Jedediah and his father, Jabez, and he was a possession of Jabez's. He was actually manumitted in 1781 by Jabez Huntington. But he did go to Roxbury with Jedediah, and he was enlisted in the forces. He was not allowed to re-enlist because at that time the Continental Congress had decided that they weren't going to accept Negro enlistments. So he went back home to Norwich, but then a year later, another son of Jabez, Joshua Huntington, was asked to build a ship in Norwich, and it was actually became known as the Continental Frigate named Confederacy. This was a warship with 32 guns, was built outside of Norwich. It had a brief and not too illustrious history, but this is a crew list from 1779. The captain was, sorry, I've forgotten the captain's name, but down here at the bottom, Samuel Huntington. Now, I know that a white family member of the rich and powerful Huntingtons was not serving as a seaman on the Confederacy, a warship during the Revolutionary War. This is that same Sam. And then church records in Norwich have this listing: Samuel, a Negro, died December 28, 1811 at age 60. And I believe that that is the same Sam that we've been talking about. Served in the Revolutionary War, was an enslaved man, was freed in 1781. So you can put these stories together from these little clues. Just to talk about some other records. Church records, I just want to point out, are very hit and miss among Connecticut towns. And the reason for that is there was a separation in thought between ministers of these various towns. Some of the ministers accepted enslaved people as church members and recorded their baptisms and their deaths. This record was mostly kept by this B. Lord, who was an enslaver himself, as you can see. That is Benjamin Lord, and he served the church there in Norwich from 1742 until 1778. And he did accept enslaved persons as church members and recorded their vital records. An example of the other theory of thought is embodied by Reverend Ebenezer Devotion, who was the minister in the Second Society of Wyndham, which is now the town of Scotland, Connecticut. And he was minister there for 30 some odd years and never recorded a single enslaved person in his church records. So he was of the thought that these people couldn't be church members and weren't worth writing about. This is his probate file. You can see that he was an enslaver himself. We have 6 swine, 1 horse, 1 Negro boy named Dick, and a Negro woman named Phyllis. His neighbor, Nathaniel Huntington, there in Scotland, who was a cousin to Jabez Huntington, had a farm there. This is his will. My said wife shall have all my indoor household goods and my Negro woman called Nancy to be hers during her natural life. And you can find some manumission records in the deeds around various towns in Connecticut. Now, these records are more common after that Act of 1784, the Gradual Emancipation Act, but you can find some earlier ones. And this act, to manumit a enslaved person under this act, you had to show that they were between the age of 25 and 45. You have to show that they can support themselves. They're in good health and they desire to be free. We don't want to be freeing anybody that wants to remain enslaved, do we? So this example is from the town of Middletown, which is on the Connecticut River, also a large slaveholding area. And this is Jabez Hamlin. he is deceased, but his heirs are manumitted several of the slaves that he had held in the early 1800s. Not all towns record these in the deed books, but that's where you find them quite often. 1790 census. We can find all other free persons and slaves that are being held in Connecticut still. Here's an example from New Milford, Connecticut, where we have a whole other free persons family apparently living near each other. We have Philip Phillips, Reuben Phillips, Samuel Phillips, and Jeruel Phillips. And I have traced this family through census records following this. One odd thing about them, though, they are in the town records. Their birth, marriage, and death records were recorded by the town. You can see there near the top, Jeruel, son of Benjamin and Mary, baptized. Down below, Reuben, Shubal. But what I find odd about this is it doesn't mention that they are people of color. It doesn't mention that they are Negroes. It just lists them. So here we have a liberal town clerk in the town of New Milford in the mid-18th century. And Jeruel Phillips even got a gravestone in New Milford. And we have the runaway ads. You'll find these, of course, all over the country. They occurred here in New England also. Buying and selling. This guy on the top here is looking for a Negro manservant, 18 to 19 years of age, that was bred to farming. He's looking for a farmhand. And then down below, someone is selling a young Negro wench and her child, cheap for cash, because they didn't have any more need for them. And there's no talk about slavery in Connecticut would be complete without talking about the Black governors. And this is something that is rather unique to Connecticut. A couple other New England states have some examples, but a Black governor was actually a elected position, elected by their peers. So all of the both enslaved and free people of color of a region would vote for a governor. This wasn't a statewide office, it was a local office. And they didn't have any real power. They might mediate in some minor squabbles within their community, but they had no jurisdiction over white people whatsoever. And basically, it was a reason to have a big party every once in a while to elect these governors. And you can find a few records about them. A lot of it is narrative stuff, but there are some records. And here in Shelton, Connecticut, you see that Abel, who had been a governor, died in 1819. And then in Norwich, there's this beautiful tombstone in the old Norwich Cemetery commemorating Boston Trow, governor of the African tribe. And Boston Trow, I just want to point out, was also enslaved by Jabez Huntington. And we do have a few published narratives of people who were formerly enslaved in Connecticut. This is the life of James Mars. This is part of his narrative. He lived in the town of Canaan, Connecticut, and he mentions a Mr. Thompson. And then down below in the town records in Canaan, you can actually verify his story. Reverend Amos Thompson had a boy named James born on March 23rd, 1790. There's a little bit of discrepancy there in the birth date, but that is the birth of James Mars recorded in that town. I'm running out of time. I did have a quick case study here, but I'm going to go through it super fast in like 2 minutes. This is death records from the town of Watertown in Litchfield County, Connecticut. And these arrows point out to Obed Lindsley, who died in that town in 1860. You can see he was 87 years old. He was a widower. He died of old age. He was a Black laborer, and it notes that he was the last slave. Now, I can't pass through a record like that without wanting to know what the story is. I actually found his manumission records. He was manumitted by a man named Edmund Lockwood. After his manumission, Obed Lindsley remained in the town of Watertown, and he actually owned property. There is a probate file for him. If you can read that really quickly, he owns some real estate that's of some value, but not much else that is of any value. And the town did record his marriage to his wife, the birth of his children, and their deaths. And I actually found out where he came from. I went back to his manumission records, this Colonel Edmund Lockwood, who manumitted him. His wife was Nancy Judson. Nancy Judson was the granddaughter of a Major Ager Judson. And you can see up at the top there, Major Ager Judson had a child named Obed, baptized in 1779. Nancy did marry Edmund Lockwood of Watertown. She was the granddaughter of Major Ager Judson. You can see here, this is a distribution of Major Judson's estate. At the bottom there, two Negroes named Caesar and Obed. And I also see in his inventory at the top there, Assel and Linda, Negro slaves. They're named together, which kind of would make you think they might be a couple. And I actually think that Linda and Asahel were probably Obed's parents. And I just got some things here that I need to continue to pursue to document that if I can. And that is the end of my talk. And I thank you very much for listening, and we'll entertain some questions. Okay, I see in the chat stream here a couple of things. Scarlett mentions the book Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery. Yes, that was written by Anne Farrow. Marvelous book. I actually meant to mention that. Teresa, who is a Facebook friend of mine, mentions that she has traced her grandparents in Greenwich, Connecticut back, and yes, it can be done. Are there any other questions?
Pauline, Joe asked in the chat if you get any pushback on your research.
Occasionally, yes. As I said at the beginning, there are a lot of people who don't believe that slavery ever existed in Connecticut, and it's pretty easy to prove that it did, if the people want to hear that. As far as details about their lives, occasionally, but as a genealogist, genealogists are all about documentation, and I can provide documents for everything that I'm putting out there as into the public domain.
Well, I do believe that was the last question, unless anybody else has anything. Pauline, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I'm sure I will see you later on as we continue through the conference.
Absolutely.
So, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
So, oh, I have one more question that just popped up from Scarlett. It says, have you worked with the Witness Stones Project in Connecticut or any other site to share your history?
I haven't. I am very well aware of the Witness Stone Project, and Dennis, I know somewhat, and we've chatted some. But as far as I use some of their information, I don't believe that they've used any of my information yet because we're working in different towns.
So, and Teresa Vega had says she has a question too, but I'm not seeing it. Oh, hey, here it is. It says, have you come across issues with naming conventions of enslaved or formerly enslaved people?
Oh, yeah. Mostly because even if records were listed in town records, very rarely did they include any sort of a surname. And quite often there is no name mentioned, and that infuriates me because it'll just list, Negro girl died on such and such a date. It's like, they knew her name. They really could have just, jotted it down. The other problem I run into is a lack of imagination in names. Let's just put it that way. They seem to use the same names over and over and over again. It can be difficult separating out the different people and making sure that you are not looking at just one person, but two people.
Yeah. So we run into that as well. And we have reached our time limit. Once again, thank you so much. It really, I know historians like me owe a huge debt of gratitude to genealogists. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you, and we'll see you around.
See you around.
Bye.